In my experience reviewing gaming laptops, I feel like a lot of them are fairly similar in what they sacrifice to lower the cost. For example, most gamers are willing to sacrifice the trackpad and speakers for lower cost because they have a mouse and headphones for gaming. And because of this, I feel like which gaming laptop I recommend to someone comes entirely down to their budget. With this laptop, there is something that it does better than every other 15-inch gaming laptop that I've reviewed. It also comes with its own set of compromises, so it's not like a universal recommendation to everyone, but take a look at what it offers and make your purchasing decision based on what your workflow requires and what you value in a laptop. So let's talk about this thing. The build of the OMEN 15 is good overall. In terms of flex and structural rigidity, the screen is quite soft, definitely all plastic there. The keyboard deck has been reinforced with metal underneath. It kind of bows downwards until it hits this metal piece. The paint they used, however, does not feel cheap at all, and that has been a complaint of mine with a lot of higher end laptops as well. Some of them use paint that feels like cheap plastic, so I think this is something worth praising. The hinge is a one-hand open, partly due to the weight of the laptop. It would need to be a lot tighter to pull the base of the laptop up along with it, and because of that, combined with the screen wobble, I think they could have tightened up the hinge to reduce the screen wobble without any trade-offs. In terms of design and aesthetics, I really like the simple interior and exterior. Cheap laptops now are starting to look nice on the exterior, but I feel like a lot of them are still a bit too aggressive with the interior design, and having that consistency is really nice. The keyboard I'm not a big fan of purely because of how shallow the key travel is, but there are some unique features about this that I do like and I think some other laptops could copy. I think this might be one of the more relevant compromises that people should be aware of. It makes it not enjoyable or comfortable to type on, which I guess depends on the way you type. If you poke with your index finger, this isn't really relevant to you, but if you type with like all 8 fingers and your thumb, then yeah, I do prefer more key travel. In terms of typing speed, no issues there. On the second typing test that I did on this laptop, I got 118 words per minute. And as I always say, if you're lacking key travel, it hurts the typing comfort, and if you lack key travel and tactility on a laptop keyboard, your speed and accuracy will take a big hit. Now, what I like about this is it uses a standard 10 keyless layout, and I guess if you're a number pad user, you're probably not going to like this, but my personal keyboard uses a 10 keyless layout and it makes the arrow keys just a little bit easier to find without having to look down. I like the standard layout of this. The trackpad isn't very good, but it is a reasonable compromise to reduce the cost for a gaming laptop. If you're lightly gliding over the surface, I would say it's quite smooth. It's not slick, but you don't feel that rough, gritty sandpaper texture that some trackpads have. But once you give it a bit of pressure, like when you're using drag and drop and you're holding the trackpad down, that's when you start to feel some resistance. The tracking accuracy is quite poor. The cursor often skips around, which I believe you can see in this accuracy test, and it also has poor directional accuracy. There's a pair of side-firing speakers, just like the older XPS 13. Volume-wise, they get very loud, enough to where if you go full volume, it can actually get a little bit uncomfortable, so more than loud enough. The bass response is pretty much non-existent. There's very little of that, so it's mostly mid-range with the treble pulled back just a little bit. I will note that between 400 and 750 Hz, the speakers seem to have this relatively quiet buzzing, which I have seen before on a couple other laptops, the Razer Blade Stealth being one of them. At this point, I think it's just the fact that cheap laptop speakers buzz when you try and play certain frequencies, usually in the mid-range, so if you see this with your unit, then just keep that in mind. Unfortunately, with my unit, I'm running the 1080p 60Hz screen, but there is an option for you to upgrade to a 144 and 300Hz panel. The brightness on it is about average with most 144Hz panels. It's around 280 nits, give or take 10 nits depending on your luck. The rest of the measurements are all just okay, not terrible, and for a $900 laptop, it's what I would expect in terms of image quality. To be clear though, like just looking at it, nothing stands out as being particularly bad. This is just for people who want an objective measurement to compare against other laptop screens. If you want my subjective opinion, there are very few screens out there that actually look bad to the human eye. You generally want brightness above 250 nits, preferably mid 300s, but for a gamer, everything else doesn't really matter in terms of image quality. For ports, you have power, Ethernet, one USB-A, an HDMI port, a headphone jack, and a full-size SD slot. And on the right, there's two more USB-As, a mini display port, and a Thunderbolt 3 port. Upgradability is one of this laptop's bigger strengths, but there are two things that I would like to note. To get inside, there are 8 Phillips head screws and a whole bunch of clips holding the bottom panel in place. If you don't have a suction cup, the rear exhaust grill is made of soft plastic, so that's where you're going to want to slip your PIC or credit card into to unlatch the clips. Once you get inside, there are 2 RAM slots and 2 M.2 slots, but unfortunately, the Wi-Fi card is soldered on. It is running the Intel AX200 for Wi-Fi 6, so I don't see this being an issue for the next few years, but just throwing that out there. I think the biggest strength of this laptop is its thermals. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe it has manual fan control where you can set the RPM specifically, but there is an option for you to max out the fans at full speed. The downside is that this might actually be the loudest laptop that I've heard when the fans are at full speed, but the upside is that the amount of air that comes out of the exhaust fans genuinely surprised me. This thing is like a hairdryer, and the temperatures are much better than every other laptop that I've reviewed. Now, granted, I've never actually reviewed one of those like massive 20-pound laptops before. Those might actually have better thermals than this, but to compare against some other similarly sized 15-inch laptops, this is able to dissipate more power at a significantly lower temperature. Now, usually with these thin and light gaming laptops, like the Razer Blade 15 and the MSI GS66, you can expect around 75 watts at 95 degrees with a CPU stress test, but this thing dissipates 90 watts at 84 degrees. And the only reason it doesn't go any higher is because that's the default long duration power limit for Intel's Turbo Boost. If you raise that limit, you could, in theory, get faster performance, but Intel Power Gadget hasn't worked for me with any of the 10th generation laptops that I've used, so unfortunately I don't have any measurements for that. Now, one thing that I want to note, and I want to clarify before I say this that I don't think this is a big enough issue to warrant a deal breaker for most people, but when I ran a combined CPU and GPU stress test to check the thermals under the absolute worst case scenario, the battery did drain while the charger was plugged in. It only comes with a 200 watt charger, which for every other RTX 2060 laptop is perfectly fine. In fact, most 15-inch laptops with an RTX 2060 come with a 180 watt charger, but because of how good the thermals are, the boost clocks are so high that it consumes more than 200 watts of power under a full system load. Now, the reason I say this isn't an issue is because 1, this is only under 100% CPU and GPU load. It did not drain any battery while gaming. 2, there are performance profiles where you can reduce the amount of power the CPU and GPU can pull, making this perform just like any other gaming laptop except with even lower temperatures. And 3, unless you're hitting the system at full load for like 10 hours, it shouldn't completely drain the battery. If you need maximum performance for a couple hours, no problems there. If you need it for an entire day, however, then it's probably wise to lower the power consumption so it's not cooking your laptop anyway. To drain the battery requires a serious amount of power and heat, which I don't recommend maintaining for an entire day non-stop. That'd be kind of silly. So be aware of this, but also know that you can reduce the power draw, which will stop it from draining the battery while plugged in. And on the topic of the battery, there's a 70 watt hour battery inside. It's not particularly big. I think the average is around 80 watt hours for thin and light gaming laptops, but you should pull around 4 to 4.5 hours of battery life with this thing. So who would I recommend this to? If you go on HP's website, there are 2 versions of this laptop. There's an Intel and an AMD version. The AMD version, at the same spec with a GTX 1660 Ti, costs $130 less. And it's not just from the CPU. Upgrading to 16 gigs of RAM is half the price on the AMD version for whatever reason. But at the recommended configuration of $1490 for the Intel version and $1360 for the AMD version, I don't think this laptop is a particularly great value, but I can fully recommend it if you care a lot about upgradability, thermals, and performance. particularly the thermals if you're someone who plays a lot of heavy games or in general does a lot of work where you're putting the system under heavy load for an extended period of time. And in exchange for that, you get a not so great keyboard. I think that's the one major weakness compared to other gaming laptops that start at, for example, $1,400 like Lenovo's Legion lineup of gaming laptops. So yeah, that's the end of this review. I hope that helped you in deciding whether or not this laptop is right for you, and I will see you in 50 years in my next video.